Welcome to the Node Technical Steering Committee meeting for October 1st, 2020. We'll follow the standard agenda, which was as identified in issue number 933 within the TSC repo. Before we get to the issues tagged for the agenda, does anybody have any announcements that they'd like to share? Okay, so no announcements this week. So let's move on to the issues that were tagged for the agenda. The first one is make recursive RMDIR more strict. This is 35250. And we have Benjamin here today as a guest to help us talk through and give us some context on that one.
Yeah, let me give you, do you want me to jump right in?
Yep, go for
it. So we wanted to add recursive remove functionality about a year ago. We added it, so it's been kind of an experimental status for quite some time. There was a lot of discussion when we originally added it. It was, there was a couple attempted and then removed attempts at it. And long story short, there was a lot of contention about whether it comes in as a new method like fs.rm, or if it's a flag on the existing RMDIR feature. We landed on it being a feature on RMDIR. Doing a little bit of a literature review of other languages, I don't think this is a huge deal. Lots of languages have recursive remove. Like I kind of summarize it in that issue. Like Dino has it, .NET has it. There's a couple other. What's a little weird about our implementation, and what a few folks have come in and chimed in about, is we are really loose about not throwing on errors compared to what I saw in a lot of other languages. Like we allow you to give it a path that doesn't exist and it just kind of eats that error. We allow you to give it a file instead of directory path, which is kind of a little confusing because it's on the remove directory method. So a couple of folks from the community came in and like a couple months ago, and it was, and they kind of made the case like, listen, this is really loose. We can't catch errors. It's difficult, and we kind of had a contentious discussion around it. I was of the opinion that we've had it on RMDIR for a year. It has a lot of adoption. If you Google GitHub, like we ourselves use it quite a bit. I'd like to get it out of experimental. But I did start to come around to this argument that we're really loose on suppressing errors, which is a little weird. So I was like, well, okay, like what if we have a flag that lets you be more loosey-goosey, but we kind of move towards a stricter implementation that is a little more in line with what other frameworks are doing. So like throw if you give it a file instead of a path, throw if you give it a path that doesn't exist. That's in line with .NET. But another person on the Node project said they'd be a pretty hard -1, a G1, because it would just be inconvenient to have to be checking paths before you do the delete. So I think we've hit this impasse. Right? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I have one quick question on that one. Like, it's what's the point about checking paths? Like, is it that you specified some intermediate paths that don't exist, or?
Yeah, exactly. Like I think it would basically be like, my program compiles a directory. It's TypeScript, and I have a cleanup step that's always cleaning up dist/foo or something. And then my program, one time I didn't run the compile step, but I always run this cleanup step at the end. So now my little script I've written that does that cleanup is going to throw on not found or something in the stricter form, if you happen to have not run the compile step and then run the clean step. So it can be more inconvenient because if you've kind of written the really naive implementation, or I don't want to call it naive, but if you've written an implementation that assumes that, oh, it's fine if I happen to have not run compile and then I run clean, then you're gonna start throwing in this new world, right?
Right. So it's not intermediate, like, you don't have like X, Y, Z and you've missed X. It's just that you haven't created Z at the end. Like
I think it's more likely that I think people are using the recursive functionality a lot it would be for like cleanup steps, like you have a dist folder you're always cleaning up. Mm-hmm. So it would be like you haven't run compile, but you have a cleanup step that always deletes that disk.
Right.
So you'd start throwing.
So it's more like you said RMX, but you didn't create X.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
So I think the two kind of options that are there's three options out there really. The third one, I don't know if it's actually a viable option. The first option would be we kind of go stricter. We match .NET's behavior, so it is breaking for the community. It will catch some people, but it's a little more in line, I think, with some of the other platforms that we would throw if you give it a missing path. Maybe throw if you give it I think if you're going to go strict, I'd rather be strict on both accounts. Like throw if you give it a file instead of a path. Throw if you give it something that doesn't exist. And then you use a flag and you can go back to the loose behavior where we don't throw in those two scenarios. Or alternatively, keep it exactly as it is. That's going to disrupt the least people. You don't throw on those two error cases, but there is a way to make it stricter for people. So you can pass like a strict flag or something, and suddenly you get the behavior that's closer to .NET or Dino or Python. The third case that people were arguing adamantly for was that we only have the strict functionality and we revisit that decision from a year ago and pull it out into its own method where we have like a RMRF method, which is what Ruby has. So Ruby has no recursive like RMDIR, but they have a RMRF method that behaves like ours does today. So we're just having trouble reaching. I think like what I feel strongest about is I think really should get this thing away from being experimental. Like people are relying on it. Like it's a really useful feature. It's not reinventing the wheel. A lot of other languages have it. But like there's a lot of contention around like, do we go stricter and you can provide a config to go to looser? Do we stick to our guns with the really loose approach? You can maybe provide a flag to go stricter. And I think whichever way we choose, I think is not going to make some of the people in the community happy because the folks who have come in from the community are really adamant about there being a separate recursive method, which I'm less excited about it because it kind of relitigates something we talked about a year ago. But maybe we should relitigate it. I don't know.
One question for me is, like, if you specify a file versus a directory, what happens today? Does it delete that one file or does it? Yeah. Okay.
Correct.
So it's not really an error in sense of the way it currently works.
Yeah, it's basically it's the behavior of RMRF today, which I think is like Ruby has its own RMRF method, right, which makes it less confusing. I think we're closest to Dino and its behavior. Like Dino does let you remove a file. They don't let you touch a path that doesn't exist, I believe, if I recall from like my playing with it. But I mean, we don't have to just copy another language.
No, but
as we understand, most of the operating systems, Linux, Unix, Windows, and Mac have RMDIR capability, which provide the specification for this. And RMDIR is an experimental API. So what is stopping us from conforming to the operating system behavior?
I think that would be like huge breakage, right? Because our RMDIR is very, very sensitive, right? Like if the directory is not empty, it will throw an error, right? Whereas ours is more like RMRF, right?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. And the pipe. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the API being experimental, right? We never gave any guarantee that this is how it's going to work in the future.
Right, but given its wide adoption, we're going to be causing a lot of breakage while we hide behind the veil of it being experimental, right? Which is all right because that's what experimental means. But I mean, do we actually want that kind of breakage, right? But I kind of agree with you. I was also thinking from what Ben was saying that it's kind of a misnomer to call it RMDIR because RMDIR is the sensitive variety. RM minus RF is like the sledgehammer, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a misnomer to call it RMDIR and then make it a sledgehammer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the point is today, if we agree or if we look at the wide adoption and try to set it as a standard, tomorrow another set of people can come and say, hey, look, this is not at all conformance to the standard OS practices. So there will always be two types of arguments, and that would be the very root of our experimental versus stable graduation model where we came up. So if we are not honoring the experimental status, then that would essentially mean that even before we think about any feature inclusion, we would need to take care of the adoption and the risk around that.
I would say, like, I'm not in disagreement. I think it would be less disruptive to people if we went the .NET kind of recursive approach, which is like we throw on I think if we went all the way to Python's API, which is exactly the same as Rimdir, so it has to be an empty folder already. That I think that's not that useful of a feature, and I think it would, like, at that point, like, you might as well just, like, it's just, I don't think that useful for the existing users of this who are using it to clean up like a dist folder. But I think if we were going to go really, so the strictness I would advocate would be we throw on file paths, we throw on missing paths so that people can start to do some error handling. But then I would say, like, potentially add a RMRF method instead of a RMDIR method, which is the super permissive version. That was my favorite solution I saw.
If we were starting today, like from the discussion, it almost sounds like we just call what we have RMRF.
Probably, yeah.
Like you said, basically that's what it does, right? Like it's maybe, you know, we don't have to be exactly the same as what's out there, but it almost sounds like we wouldn't have this discussion if it was called RMRF.
Correct. Yeah, I agree, and I question, like, how much, I don't know, maybe people are building different things than me, but like I feel like having the recursive method where I have to already have emptied the folder and like have to have met all these constraints already, it's not that useful, right? Like, from an ergonomics point of view.
Right.
Honestly, to me, since we've already called it Rumdir, to me, what would make sense would be like Rumdir, and then you have flags, right? You have recurse, and then you have force, just like with RM, right? And so we will kind of have rolled RM and Rumdir into one. Having called it Rumdir already, we're kind of committed to that, or are we?
Well, are we? Like, I think, like, you know, why bother having an experimental phase if we're never going to be willing to change something?
Yeah, exactly. So
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, to me, Rumdir is the sensitive variety, and then you give it additional powers by giving it flags. You give it the power to recurse, right? And then you give it the power to forcefully remove things, right? So
overall, we all seem to agree that it is useful to have both modes. One that is going to remove potential files in the folders, and that's just going to be like RM and RF. And the other mode is where it's going to throw an error in case there's a file somewhere. And the main problem is that this feature has been adopted a lot, even though it is still experimental. And we could check how much it is breaking in modules. That's what I would do at the moment. And even though it is experimental, I do see the point into changing the default to be the more strict one, because that's more fitting to the name, and to add the new one, but to keep the behavior at least for a while, and to add a deprecation warning in case there is something detected that would break the user. That way they have an intermediate time where they're able to switch into the new API, and then we're good to go. That would be my favorite solution.
It's an experimental, so.
Absolutely, but it is still adopted a lot because people have really craved for that feature.
So then let's remove from experimental, deprecate that. Okay, move it, and then add the new API. So, which is weird. Let's essentially, it's if people are using this in the wild, let's just deprecate it, deprecate what is in there right now, and do a full deprecation cycle. And then in 15, leave it as it is in 14, do it, or maybe just add the new API in 14 and do and deprecate that in 15 or 16, and then remove it, deprecate the old one in 15 and then remove it in 16.
Yep.
So I assume we backported it already to 14, or it was in 14 as experimental.
Yeah, it definitely was. I think it goes this. I think it might be in 12 actually. Yeah, I have to check.
It is stable.
Yeah.
The problem that Martin mentioned sounds very good, but perhaps we should add a dog deprecation earlier, like not a runtime deprecation, but just mentioning the dogs that migrate to the new IP.
I kind of agree with Gabriel's point, though, that it's maybe the least breaking if we do have like the force and the recurse, and like maybe don't revisit adding. And is anyone making a case that we do add a new method right now? Like it sounded. Are we more making the case we default to stricter behavior and add this additional flag?
I was more like, if we could just like, is that any less breaking just renaming it to RMRF and being happy with what it does?
Oh, interesting.
Right, like that's what, like, I think if we started today, we would just call it RMF, and then it doesn't sound like anybody would be too upset, right? And we could talk separately about whether you want to add an RMDIR with stricter, checking or whatever, or an option on our RMF that would give you some more error checking, but I don't know.
No, that seems like I'm open to that. Like I think so we, like Matteo said, it's not experimental, but we're telling people it's deprecated, and we have this. All you have to do is rename your RMDIR recursive over to RMRF, and it's the exact same behavior. Just migrate your app to this.
Right.
And we stop fiddling with flags, which I think does start to get a little like choose your own adventure, which is kind of not great.
Tobias wants to join.
Oh, sorry. Thanks.
Yeah. Actually, the rename is probably the cleanest solution, because you can just set your whole, you can just set your whole Git repo, and fix it in one shot. It's a lot more of a systematic change than going to every cause site and just adding an options object with flags and all that. Seems like a much cleaner solution.
And it sounds like then the naming reflects what we want too, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Thing.
And we're not alone. This is what Ruby did. Ruby's recursive remove is just called RMRF, and they do have a RMDR. It's just very strict, like our old one. So like other folks have done this.
So it would be, I guess it's, like we could rename with a, I don't know, alias or whatever that points to from the old name to the new name, and then I guess then that comes into Matteo's suggestion of deprecating the RMDIR version, right?
So then my only question is, do we feel comfortable only doing that in docs, or do you think it should be a console warning? Like, I'm just a little worried we'll have some apps break on people. But.
Yeah, well, it's fine, as long as we follow our deprecation cycle. Like, I would call what we have stable. Like, it went out in 12, it's used everywhere. If it's used wildly, it needs to be called stable of what it is. So
yeah, it's de facto stable.
It's de facto. It's like async hooks. Okay, in theory it's experimental. In practice, we can change them without breaking everybody. So from my point of view, we can just
I guess it's like, it worries me though that it's going to be harder to get things in as experimental if effectively they're not experimental, right?
Well, if it stays experimental for years. If it
right,
stays
we're not in this case, so I don't bring in async hooks. Like, this is a case where, how long has it been an experimental?
About a year, I think.
Right.
Like
so
10 months to a year.
It's getting there. So,
I think Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay. So if we do this alias, right, then the warning that we would throw about, if we were to do the code warning rather than the doc warning, would we throw, or would we produce the warning only if RMDIR would be used in such a way that would be normally covered by the new function RMRF? Because I mean, if you do remove non-recursively an empty directory, there should be no warning, right? Because that's what we intend RMDIR to be eventually, right?
Oh, that's an interesting point. I don't know. I would have thought the deprecation would be just on have you used the recursive flag true, just to take, like, that's probably the best proxy.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Because so RMDIR would stay, but just the flag would go away. That
Yeah, essentially, yeah. That would be my take. So it can take a few, like, I would not touch that current behavior, essentially.
So node 50. Oh, go ahead,
Michelle. This is the wild, okay? So the key so the important point in this decision is how much it's used in the wild. So what key modules are using this API out there? If it's used by RimRaf or something like that, or whatever, then which will, if we removed it today, how much, what would break in the ecosystem? This is the question.
There's definitely, like, I've done some research, like, if you even just look on GitHub for Rimdir node recursive true, there's hundreds or thousands of projects. But even, like, I was talking to my friends who are working on Redwood.js, which is a framework for, and they use it, like, everyone uses it because they missed the fact that it was experimental. Like, and I think speaks to bad, like, that speaks to, we should have had an experimental warning in the console from day one, and we didn't, because we went with the loose experimental in the docs, and it kind of, I think that was a process issue that could be revisited. Like, it should be thought about in the future if we add more popular features like this. Like, I think it's out of Pandora's box for sure.
So I try to summarize it again in text, and I see like 4 main steps. Let's mark the current API as stable, since it's used a lot. We all agree upon that. Second, let's rename the current API in a way that we add a new one. For example, RM, you could use a different name, maybe a different flag. I don't care. And while keeping the current API still working as an alias. And then we deprecate the alias. And as a 4th step, we add a new functionality wherever, I don't know, that has the stricter version that people would expect with the current API.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only one I wasn't 100% sure if we have to do is having the stricter version, but maybe we do that. Maybe we do that. I don't think I'm not against that.
I'm sorry, folks, I got to drop. Bye-bye. Great discussion.
Bye.
Bye. So Ben,
Okay, I think
it does not really hurt.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds like a really good resolution to me. So the deprecation would be in node 15 as well as the new method potentially is kind of the plan. Okay, it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, this is what it means to be de facto stable. Is you go through the deprecation cycle as if it were stable.
Yeah, I do think we're going to find, like, we've had some things we've tried to deprecate that have dragged out for a long time, but so I just wonder if, you know, how and if it will ever actually be deprecated. But I guess this one is fairly easy. It's fairly easy to move, right? So maybe it'll have an easier chance. So I'm just taking this. So the steps are deprecate current recursive functionality, add copy as RMRF. Sorry, can you repeat that, Ruben? Just
it's actually in the chat. You can just
copy
it's in
the chat. Perfect. Okay, that's great. I was looking for that, but didn't see it.
Thanks for putting so much time into this conversation. I think that gives us a clear plan of action. That's great.
Okay, does anybody have anything else they want to talk about on this one before we move on then? If not, okay, let's move to the next issue.
I'm going to drop, but I really appreciate help on this. This is great.
Yeah, no, thanks for
Oh.
coming.
Miles is here.
Okay, thank you. I will promote him. Okay, let's then move on to the next one, which is number 35092, Punycode runtime deprecation. Don't remember who added this to the list. I think Chalker, you seem to be involved in that one. Is that?
I wasn't the one who added that, and in the last meeting, I proposed to move that to the GitHub.
Okay.
And it was added before I left a comment there, and I'm not sure why it was added. I think
Rich added it at some point, right?
Which one is this? I'm sorry.
This is the Punycode one.
Yeah, it's been, you know, doc deprecated. I'm sorry. Yeah. I think this comes down to, do we want to actually?
I think that it should go through pending deprecation because there are too many consumers of that module that don't require it from NPM. Like they don't list in dependencies, and it should probably go through pending deprecation process first, so that it would be easier to trace if one of the dependencies uses that or not. And moreover, we can notify packages that are involved about that, or users which run pending deprecation flag can notify those also.
I'm wondering, is there a reason why we would just doc deprecate as opposed to putting something into pending deprecation?
I don't think so. I'm not exactly sure why it was just doc deprecate without pending deprecation. Probably because that has been an easier change in both ways to discuss and to implement.
Okay, so I mean, I guess I just does like going forward, if we're seeing things that are just adding doc deprecations, we probably want to add this to make sure they get added to pending as well at the same time.
Perhaps. I mean, pending implies that we're going to runtime deprecate, and perhaps we aren't. You know, I don't know, maybe, but yeah.
Right. Okay. So, but maybe it's the if.
Anyway, we should.
If you want to actually deprecate it, then that should have gone through that, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, here's the thing.
Here's
the thing. I run with node pending deprecations turned on in my environment. Like, just that's in my bash RC or whatever. I guess I'm using C now because everybody in Mac is. But anyway, so I see tons of deprecations when using npm, when using all sorts of things. And so I actually think we want to be judicious with that because, we want people to see warnings when they turn on pending deprecations, but we don't want people to become numb to them. And I am numb to them. I see them all the time now. And I just yesterday got confused between process binding and process UMask deprecations because I'm seeing 30 deprecations every time I run npm. And so, but that's a larger conversation. Actually, let's focus this back on Punycode.
Sure.
But I see your point. Just wanted to offer that my experience running pending deprecations is that I now just ignore all the deprecation warnings. And maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I just shouldn't have it turned on all the time. Maybe I should turn it on for specific things. I have to think about that as well. So anyway,
I guess it's something for module owners. We should potentially be trying to promote, advocate to run your CI with that turned on, like at least have a job with that turned on, right? Because it seems like if we put stuff in there, but it's not necessary, people aren't necessarily seeing it.
Maybe. That and also treat warnings as errors is a pretty potent combination. But,
Right.
But back to Punycode. Did we deprecate it because it's not being maintained upstream anymore, or we plan on stopping using it, or what was the reason for it, or just we should have never exposed it in the first place? I actually wonder if we want to punt on this for now and get to Miles's NPM 7 thing, because that's probably that's urgent. Whereas this, if this waits another week or something, that's fine.
I'm happy with that suggestion.
Plus, it saves me from having to educate myself, while we're on this talk.
I'm not even sure if we need to discuss the Punycode thing at all here, because I think it should be moved back to GitHub. What do you think, Rich?
I would be like, I'm like, you've made a concrete suggestion, which seems reasonable. Maybe we can take the tag off, and then if somebody wants to put it back on, because I don't think that's the reasonable suggestion, we could do that.
Okay, I'll take the tag off, and I'll also mention that I like Chakra's suggestion, and maybe we'll see if that moves it forward a bit.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so yeah, so now that Miles is here, I know, Miles, you wanted to spend some time, so take it away.
Hello, how y'all doing today? So we have a PR open now for the NPM RC for 7.0. I'll drop that in the chat right now. I've kicked off CI and SitGim on it. Excuse me, our hope and intention is to have this ship in Node.js 15. We had a little bit of a policy discussion in the issue tracker, which was great. We got to the bottom of what our official policy is right now, which is that Semver majors that want to land after the cutoff of 1 month before a Semver major release just require that there's no objections from the TSC. So I guess you could think of this as kind of like an impromptu heads up about what's going on, and ability to answer some questions so we can kind of just get ahead of it, recognize that we do not have the whole TSC here, but we do have quorum, so that is nice. And just to like clarify one more time, this is not, I guess, seeking approval as I originally framed it. It is more just like, seeking consensus and ensuring that there would be, no objections. So the PR that we have open right now does require, maybe a little bit of tweaking. I can see that the linter was broken. I'll dig that up and we'll fix that as soon as possible. NPM 7 does have some breaking changes that we've shared with you in the past. The largest of these breaking changes, at least the intentional ones, is the changing to the algorithm for peer dependencies. Peer dependencies are now being like verified and enforced. One of the changes that we did make based on feedback is that the majority of cases where peer dependencies fail, you could resolve it by just picking one peer dependency over the other, which is no worse than what's currently happening. And what we do now, instead of failing on a repository that has mismatched peer dependencies, we print a warning about the mismatched peer dependencies and then resolve it appropriately. The result of this is that once we fix one more bug, which I'll talk about in a second, there are no additional failures in SitGim after we introduce NPM 7. All of the modules in SitGim that passed before and all of the platforms pass the exact same way. There is currently one bug that we've found that is specific to resource constrained hardware. So, and it is only manifesting in OS X on CI, and it is only manifesting And it manifests more when we're running more jobs at the same time. So there's, we believe it's a stream-based race condition. We are looking between it being potentially CPU or network exhaustion, but the team is actively working on that right now. But the plan for the moment is, you know, we want this RC. We'd love to see it land on master. I think there might be 1 or 2 bugs that we want to fix and cut another RC before we'd ask for it to be picked up into 15. And then we have a date of the 13th of October at which we're targeting cutting 7.0.0. So moving out of release candidacy, and we'd like to see that 7.0.0 release go out with the Node 15 release.
I'm sorry. Can you just not clear to me when you say we? Are you talking about NPM and GitHub? Or are you talking about the release? Okay.
Well, so kind of yes. I'll be more explicit now. So the NPM team has a target date of the 13th of October to cut the December major release and move it out of release candidacy, which gives a full week prior to the December major release of Node 15. And the NPM team would like to see this ship. With me as an individual, as both a release team member, as well as a TSC member, I think that this is the best thing for us to do as a project. It will not be without, you know, its ecosystem disruptions. It is, you know, including breaking changes. But I think that it's important that we get this into people's hands as soon as possible, that we get the feedback based on it as soon as possible, and that we quickly iterate and fix problems that we run into. I think longer term, there's an interest in seeing if this could get backported to 14, but I think that that would be, you know, months from now after it's had more ecosystem usage, when we can show whether or not, like, categorically that there would be no big changes in behavior. We do have ideas about how to land this in a way that would not change the peer dependency behavior, but we'd also want to ensure a similar level of correctness as well as performance. And for the NPM CLI team this quarter, like, that is one of their major focuses that their engineering effort is going to be going towards, is improving documentation, is improving performance, is in improving correctness, and, you know, making sure that this, you know, this release is extremely high quality.
So I support this completely, especially given that it's a release that's never going to be LTS 15, with the sole condition that you know, I defer to release working group on, you know, like, obviously the release working group has final say on whether something goes in the release or not. So whatever they say goes, but I support this completely. I think it's the way to go.
Anyone else have any thoughts or questions about this?
How big do you think the peer depths, like, how big do you think of an impact is that going to have? Is it like, it's understand it's breaking? Are we going to get like widespread complaints, or is it going to be just a few edge cases, or what's your take on that?
So from the Sitgin perspective, there were only 2 modules that were being broken by the peer depths change. Once we found, like, there were some bugs in the change that we fixed, but once we caught those bugs, there were only 2 modules that were broken by this, and the additional change that we made that kind of is like a fallback, that left us with 0. Also, if someone runs npm install and the peer depth change does cause a problem, there is a clear warning that has 2 different remediations, including running npm with force, which is the default. We do a subset of that now by default, which is the fallback option. But you can also pass -- legacy peer depths, which is also something you can pass as a command line argument, as a environment variable, or set in your npm RC, and that will use the legacy algorithm. So I would say, like, similar to Node, when we do these kinds of breaking changes, yes, it may break things, but it's completely reversible. So people can work in their environments to, like, if that specific change is causing a problem there's ways to avoid the breakage.
Okay, and it's it's as easy as a command line option, and then you're, it hasn't wrecked your day. You can be aware and think about it for the future, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think with that in mind, that is also part of the reason why, like, I think it makes a lot of sense to go out in 15 right now.
Right.
And I'm not trying to point fingers at anyone, but it's like, it's possible there will be bugs in Node that break your day, and there's
So yeah, for sure. Yeah,
so
yeah.
like, I don't see this as like any less of a, like, we need to work on stability than Node itself, which I actually think makes this timing really appropriate.
Yeah, I definitely, like Rich said, I think it being a 15 release that won't go LTS, it gives us some extra sort of, we'll get the people who are going to be less upset testing it out first versus people upgrading for LTS reasons.
And regarding like long-term plans with the peer deps, I think the intent is, like, we're giving the equivalent of like a runtime warning right now. So like, if we see that error of mismatched peer deps in your tree, we're gonna like print a warning right now, and we're gonna do like the better behavior, which isn't like experience breaking. But I do think that longer term, the team is interested in, changing that default. That would have to come in another Semver major release. And I think coming, like, as we get closer to 16, we can have a discussion about like what the appropriate defaults are there. But it may not be till 17 or 18 that we think about doing that. But it's like, I just want to make it clear that there is intent in deprecating this, but I think this is similar to like how we do deprecations in Node. Let's take it one release at a time. I believe that as it is right now, it is as non-disruptive as possible while still moving the needle.
Yeah. Based on that, it sounds like 15 is the right time to do it, and you've taken all the actions to make it easy for people to cope if it does cause them problems. While we then figure out and get that feedback. So seems reasonable to me. Again, like Rich said, as long as the release team's has consensus, sounds reasonable to me personally.
Any input from release people here? Bethany, Colin, someone else?
I think ship it.
Yep. Agreed.
All right then.
Any other? We still do have a few things on the agenda that we can try to get to. Unless there's some other discussion we want on this one. If not, okay, let's move on to the next issue, which was tagged, which is 35014 version 15. I don't know, Bethany, did you add this to the agenda?
I think it may have been added to talk about the UMask deprecation revert.
Right. Yes, I see. I added it to the agenda, but yeah, I think that's, where do we stand on that? I know there's been some discussion of reverting that before it goes out.
So yeah, I opened a PR to revert the deprecation. It's got approvals. I think there's no blocking in objections. So I think we're probably gonna go ahead and land that.
Okay. I think that I'm happy then that we don't need to discuss it any further. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Otherwise, I'll just take the TSC agenda label off of that. Okay, next issue then is 33879, drop minimum waiting time as a hard guideline. We did discuss this last time, and I'm just opening it up. I think we'd gone back with a suggestion. Thought we'd had a concrete suggestion that perhaps Mary was going to take back to the issue. Let me just find the minutes from last week.
just
okay,
says
yeah.
that
So
Mary
basically, it
would
says
post the
we'll post the recommendations to the issue. Yeah. Okay, and close. So I think maybe we should leave on just as a reminder, but that's the next step. So I'm going to just copy that into this week. Rename default branch from master to main. You know, I don't know, Miles, you've been active on that front, and there's sort of plugged into what's going on the GitHub front. Anything we should discuss about that this week?
GitHub has started releasing some more of the tools that make it easier to convert directly from inside of the repo. I've been off the last week, so I haven't had a chance to kind of get caught up on where it's at. I feel like the next step for us as an org is probably converting one of the repos that has a little bit more integration and eyes on it. So maybe node.js.org or node.js.dev. So I can start digging into that next week and try to get a few more repos kind of through this process.
Okay. So, sounds good. Okay, thanks. The next one is simplify copy operations and more cleanups. This is 31038. Just opening that up. So Ruben, this is your PR. I think actually it's been on the agenda a few times, but we've skipped. So we have 5 minutes now. I don't know if that's enough.
So Matteo added it into the list because it's more of a general question. There is an implicit breaking change that was not intentional originally, that I just noticed at that point of the refactoring. And it's something that we very rarely do. In most cases, this functionality would not work that way because we actually check for prototype properties if those exist on an input object. And if it does, we accept it in this rare case. While we normally always copy input values, or we at least only check for own properties on input objects. And in 99% of the time, our APIs would not check for prototype properties. So this is a rare edge case, and it's an inconsistency in our API. And we should think about if we want to ever check for prototype properties or not.
I guess first thing comes to mind, like you say, it's rare. Is this the only case, or are there others that you're aware of?
Others, because we have a lot of different ways how we write our API, but this is more by chance and not intentionally, mostly.
But you said there are others, like, so it's not as simple as saying just documenting that we don't do this kind of thing, and then this is an outlier.
Not really. We should definitely say if this happens, if it is accepted, it's not intended. That would be one outcome that we could have. Or we might have to think about, okay, we always accept it, which would be a bit weird because we would have to rewrite a lot of code for that. I personally would recommend we just don't accept it, or we mark this as an exception. But we should find a way to go in the future about this behavior.
I think, like, like if we don't have any guidance anywhere, would it make sense to write some guidance that says, that picks one of these cases? Like you said, there's different options. That picks one of the cases, and basically we PR that in somewhere. And once we have agreement on that, that kind of informs what we should do here, right? Like,
as a recommendation documentation.
Well, somewhere that says like, hey, you know, I don't know if we have anywhere, I don't know off the top of my head, that says like, hey, if you're creating a new API, these are the things that, you know, that the project has agreed constrain our APIs. We have something along those lines for adding an API APIs. It's like, these are sort of as the team, this is what we think is important, why we would add them, characteristics. If we had something similar, it seems like this would go into that just for general APIs, right?
Right, but we should probably also have something like that outlined in our general documentation for the users, so that they would know if it is a supported behavior
right.
to have prototype properties on input objects or not.
Right, you could, yeah, then if that was like our policy for how we build APIs, it could then, you're right, there could be something to the user to say, as general expectations, when you look at something, this is common practice or not. And so I'm just wondering if, like, the next step to try and resolve that, it sounds like you think we want agreement on that. So if you tried to PR in what you think is the right answer, that might trigger the conversation that's needed.
Yeah, should be fine.
Okay. So I'm just going to take a note. Next step is Ruben will PR in guidance for, creating APIs or something, creating APIs to document what we think should apply to all APIs, and that will inform what we do on this case, right? Anything else you want to discuss on that one before we move on? No? Okay.
Has to say something about it or has another opinion. I guess that's a no.
Absence, yeah, I would assume it's a no from this group. So, okay, I think that we're basically at the end of the issues, and we're at the end of time. We don't have enough time to go through strategic initiatives this time, so we'll skip that. Is there anything else that people think we need to touch on before we close out? Sounds like not. So thanks for everybody for taking the time, both those who are in the meeting and those who are watching. And we'll talk to everybody later and in GitHub. Thanks. Bye.
Later.
Thanks.
Bye.